Welcome to Ask Psych Sessions, where we ask some of the best teachers in psychology questions from you, our audience. If you would like to send in a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. That's bit.ly/AskPsychSessions, all lowercase, no spaces. And here's our next question.
I'd like to welcome Dr. Ciara Kidder from Marian University to the ASK016 special editions on jumping into online teaching unexpectedly.
So when you're used to talking in the class, how do you move this online?
That's a great question. So I do a lot of online teaching, and for a little while there, I did not want to do discussion boards because as a student, I hated them, and they're terrible to grade, and it was just insane. But then I was asking colleagues about how they run their discussion sections and have come up with a way that I think discussions can be meaningful within a classroom. One of the things that has been particularly useful is putting students into small groups. Instead of throwing the entire class onto one discussion board, putting them in groups of 4 or 5 or 6, depending on your class size, allows the discussion to be more focused. It keeps one person's post, the top post, from getting responded to all the time. So everybody gets interaction if there's fewer people. It allows for better back and forth. And also, if you kind of keep the groups consistent, it helps students build rapport with each other so that over the rest of the semester, they become a little bit more comfortable in providing commentary with one another and having that back and forth if there's just a few people in the group rather than everybody in the group. The second thing that is vital is providing different due dates. So if you're going to have students post something and then also do replies, you need to have different due dates for those two things, because you will get the students who go in at 11:55 and have 4 minutes to post their reply and all of their responses, which is fine for that person, but it's not fine when students are going in early and posting and then they don't have anybody to respond to. So providing consecutive due dates. I've done both just like an initial and then follow-ups the next day. But honestly, the best thing that's worked for me is to have multiple reply dates. So you do your first level of replies the day after the initial post, and then a second set of replies the day after that. So that way people can respond to people who have responded to them. So you really have that kind of back and forth that are useful for discussions. So that's kind of just like how I think about and set up those discussions within the classroom to help make them a little bit more meaningful. And just like with anything, any kind of assignment that you give, really giving specific criteria. One, it helps you grade and it helps them know what you're looking for. So if you want to have a word limit to make sure that they're kind of really diving into their topic. If you're going to require them to use citations, making sure that that's really clear. I even say things like you have to make explicit connections to what I had you do. So if I had them read an article and then answer some questions, I make sure that they know they have to actually talk about that article and not just give their opinion. So having those really clear guidelines helps the student be a little bit more meaningful and helps in your grading, because I just check off boxes like, did they do these things? If yes, then they get the full credit. One thing that I've also noticed is helpful is once you do an initial post and then you're asking students to do a reply, it can be really hard for students to think of things to say. Often you get oh, that's really interesting, or I agree with what you just said, and then they repeat what the person said. I've tried to provide prompts for the replies in addition to prompts for an initial discussion. So I will usually give a couple of different options as well so that people can be talking about different things. Is there something really interesting that person said connected to something you learned in a different class? Or answer these 3 things in response to what that person said. And that gives students a clear direction and helps them focus their answer rather than just asking them, just reply. That gets hard for students, and then they get stuck in that rut of just doing the really boring responses that aren't meaningful. So providing prompts for both really helps with that conversation aspect that you look for within a discussion.
That is really helpful. One follow-up question that I have for you is, what would you do right now if students already clearly have rapport with some people in the class? Would you let them self-assign into groups, or might you sort of try to distribute? Maybe if you have noticed some students are more engaged or a little clearer about material, do you try to sprinkle them around versus having, a really strong group?
That's a really good question. I think if you have a good sense of your class right now in your face-to-face sessions, you can totally be really, what's the word I'm looking for? Purposeful in forming your groups. I think kind of both of the things that you just mentioned would actually be good depending on your particular class. You can either kind of group people together that already have good rapport. Maybe you notice that you kind of have these little clumps of students sitting in different areas and they kind of chat with each other before class starts, or they work together a lot in like little in-class activities. It would be totally appropriate to put them into groups because they already have that rapport with each other. But I also think the kind of other option is good too, where you're sprinkling out the students that are more talkative in class across different groups so that they can still have that meaningful conversation. They may struggle with that a little bit more, but their conversation with the other students will be beneficial to those other students who are less likely to talk up in class, who maybe struggle a little bit more with the material. So kind of having that really top student with these students that might need a little bit more help, that purposeful creation of a group could also be really beneficial. And it helps those students. So if you put them all into all the top students into one group, you might end up with a group that just doesn't really get anything out of the discussion sections because nobody's really adding meaningful things. And then that creates a less ideal learning environment, especially if you're going from face-to-face where they would be hearing those things to online where they now no longer get to hear those things because they're not in the same groups. So sprinkling those people in a purposeful manner would be very beneficial for this kind of quick transition like that. Normally I just randomize it, but again, if you're switching from a face-to-face to an online, I think that's a great suggestion.
So those are some great ideas, and I'm already sort of thinking about how I can do that for the courses that I have this semester when we would be doing in-class activities to then make them still engaging with each other. So that's great. The other big question I was hoping you could give some insight on is assessments. I think a lot of us still had scheduled another 2 or 3 exams or celebrations of learning, as I like to call them.
I like that.
Throughout the rest of the semester. So what are your thoughts about how to adjust those? I've seen the suggestion to make them projects. I've seen to try to get monitoring software. I've seen to make them open book. How do you handle that?
So as I mentioned, I do a lot of online classes, but I've actually done online exams even with face-to-face classes because it saves time. I don't have to not have a class period where they're doing an exam. And I kind of have just come to the conclusion that if it's online, students will use their books and their notes, and I'm okay with that. But I do try my best to time it within a reasonable amount of time so that if they are looking up all the answers, they're never going to finish. I think the general rule of thumb is like 30 seconds to a minute per question if you're doing multiple choice questions. And so, if you have a 50 question exam, you could time it for like 40 minutes, and that would kind of prevent students from just being able to look stuff up. I do a lot of essay exams, and I very clearly say in the instructions that I don't want to know what Google has to say about the topic, especially because in psychology, if you try to Google stuff, it's usually way out of context and doesn't make any sense. So I can tell. But then, I also have in the grading, they've made explicit connections to the course materials, and I make them cite course materials and stuff. So that kind of helps with that idea that they are, it's open book, it's open note, but it's not really open internet because you couldn't answer the questions correctly if you just go to the internet. And there's a lot of making them provide examples rather than just definitions. If you're doing some kind of like short answer or essay question, helps with that too, because you'll be able to see, do 2 students have very similar answers in their example? Well, that's kind of strange. They probably shouldn't. So if you're kind of concerned about students working together, that would be another option. Although I think in this particular instance, if students are working from home, that's probably not the case. It's more of a question of our students cheating. And I think in this kind of case, you just have to accept that some of that will happen. Usually you can spot it, and then just setting up the parameters of the exam in a way that tries to prevent it from happening or prevent it from being widespread. There are lockdown browser, like Respondus lockdown browser, for example, that different institutions may have access to. Not all institutions have access to that, and there's definitely some people have concerns with that kind of thing, particularly the ones that use the webcam feature. I personally think that's super creepy and very strange, but people like to use that, so that is an option. It does require sometimes that causes more barriers for students if they don't have just the right browser, or their because it's something they have to like install on their computer, and that can cause some technical issues. And if the goal is to try to make things a little easier for students, then that might not be the best option for your classes.
Those are very helpful suggestions. I can see how it might feel a little fraught if you're used to having a all closed book, multiple choice exam, but I think the timing gives people some options, and I think, maybe also the idea to be a little more flexible. I'm at an advantage that none of my classes are huge, but I imagine for my colleagues that are teaching multi-hundred person sections, it's good to know that even if you're going to stay with multiple choice, there's going to be some good options.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that you can do, especially, and I'm sure most people who do these large multiple section courses, or these huge like 400 person courses, are already coming up with different versions. But you can actually, for many of the LMSs, allow you to like either upload or type in all of your exam questions anyways, and then you would have more than one version. If you want to have it randomized, you can have all the questions getting randomized on any given exam. That will also kind of bring down the possibility that students are sharing answers, or that students are working together on something in the online setting as well.
Great. That is another good point, right? We don't want to remind them that this is an open book test. I always say it means open materials, but not open other humans.
Right.
So I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today, and I'm sure that you are going to be helping many colleagues feel a little more confident as we make these sort of abrupt transitions. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.